August 19th, 1942. Staff Sergeant Louis Battaglia crouched in what the Marines generously called a field kitchen on Guadalcanal, which was really just a tarp strung between two trees, a makeshift stove built from salvaged oil drums, a few dented pots, 2 knives that could barely hold an edge, and enough flies to qualify as a separate military unit. He was staring at numbers scribbled on a mud-streaked clipboard, numbers that didn't need a calculator to look catastrophic. He didn't need a general's briefing, a logistics table, or war college credentials. He just needed common sense. The math was simple. Too many mouths to feed, not enough food to feed them. He looked at the supplies. Less than 2 months' worth of standard-issue rations for a full Marine division if you stretched them. But nobody was calculating based on normal consumption. These weren't desk-bound Marines eating in mess halls with flatware and napkins. These were jungle-bound soldiers burning calories every waking moment, sweating through their uniforms, slogging through muck, hauling ammunition, clearing brush, and digging foxholes in sweltering heat. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. They needed at least 4,000 calories a day to perform at peak efficiency. What they were getting? Barely 1,500, and even that was dropping daily. The Japanese Navy had decisively won the Battle of Savo Island 12 days earlier, sinking 4 Allied heavy cruisers and forcing the rest of the fleet to bolt for safer waters. The supply ships meant to keep the 1st Marine Division alive had sailed away, still holding 60% of their cargo in their hulls. Food, ammunition, medical supplies, fuel, it all left the island before the Marines could secure it. Now, here they were, stranded on a humid, mosquito-choked island, surrounded by enemy soldiers, cut off from reliable supply, trying to hold the single most strategically vital piece of land in the Pacific, Henderson Field. Louis Battaglia understood something critical. The Marines could survive without new uniforms. They could fight with worn boots, patched shirts, or borrowed ammunition, but they could not fight if they were starving. He walked through the camp. Marines sat on overturned ammunition crates, gnawing on hardtack like it was gravel. Some had already begun losing weight, 5-10 pounds. Their faces were sunken, movements slower. Young riflemen who should have been bursting with energy instead sat in silence, heads drooping with exhaustion. These weren't combat casualties, not yet. These were logistics casualties. His commanding officer had plenty of concerns: enemy artillery, infiltration by Japanese scouts, unreliable radios, malaria outbreaks. Food was just one issue among many, but Battaglia thought differently. He saw food not as comfort, but as ammunition. Ammunition for the human body. That morning, as he sliced open a crate of canned hash, he watched a young Marine named Patterson, barely 19, scooping rice from a captured Japanese supply sack. "Where'd you get that?" Battaglia asked. "Supply dump near the ridge. Japs left in a hurry," Patterson replied. Battaglia stared at the rice. Clean, untouched, in perfect condition. And near it canned fish, seaweed wraps, pickled vegetables, food that could hold in the jungle heat far better than American supplies. He called 2 Marines. "Collect everything edible from every captured cache. I don't care if it's labeled in Japanese. If it's food, we'll figure out what it is." Technically, that was against regulations. All captured material was supposed to be inventoried, stored, and reported. But inventory sheets didn't feed soldiers, and paperwork didn't win battles. By nightfall, Battaglia had amassed several crates of Japanese rice, tins of mackerel, pickled radishes, dried plums, and powdered barley tea. He tasted each sample himself. He cooked some, boiled some, ground some into paste. He observed the results. Some Marines reacted with confusion. Was this allowed? Was this safe? Battaglia didn't just feed them, he explained. This rice? Twice the calories of hardtack, easier to digest, keeps longer in this heat. These pickled vegetables? Salt and vitamins. Safer and stronger than those mushy beans we've got rotting in the crates. They listened. Because they were hungry. Battaglia kept experimenting. He boiled rice using coconut water instead of scarce fresh water, adding electrolytes to every serving. He mixed Japanese fish with American beans, creating high-protein stews that Marines devoured. He used discarded helmet liners as rice steamers. He even taught Marines how to identify edible jungle plants, taro root, breadfruit, wild papaya. Within 2 weeks, the Marines under his feeding program stopped losing weight. They looked stronger, more alert, more capable. But the greatest change? Their morale. Men who were quiet and despairing now laughed in chow lines. They talked about recipes, joked about becoming chefs after the war, bragged about their platoon's Battaglia chow superiority. In a jungle full of misery, he had given them something precious: dignity, the sense that they were not just surviving, but living. It was during this time that an exhausted lieutenant colonel visited the makeshift kitchen and watched as Battaglia folded rice into a broth made from Japanese fish and American ration powder. "It smells incredible," the officer muttered. "Because it is," Battaglia replied, ladling the mixture into tins. The officer raised an eyebrow. "This isn't regulation." "Sir," Battaglia said, without looking up. "Regulations don't win battles. Strength does." That line would later appear in internal memos. Years later, it would even show up in military nutrition studies. By the midpoint of the Guadalcanal campaign, word had spread beyond the 1st Marine Division. Quartermasters began altering ration procedures. Forward cooking stations became common. Captured enemy food was not only allowed but encouraged, provided it was inspected and safe. Within months, the U.S. military nutrition doctrine had shifted. No longer were rations simply measured by weight and shelf life. They were measured by performance, value, calories, vitamins, hydration, endurance, benefit. This system, improvised under a tarp on a bug-infested island, became the foundation for what we now know as combat feeding operations. Long after the war, military historians would study Guadalcanal for its lessons in amphibious warfare, intelligence strategy, and airfield control. But the most overlooked lesson remained the simplest. Wars are not just fought with bullets and bombs, they are fought with calories. "Look at any soldier on the line," Battaglia would say. "His rifle is important, his ammunition is critical. But his strength? That comes from what's on his plate." Battaglia's influence extended beyond his lifetime. During the Vietnam War, logistics specialists cited Guadalcanal as the first proof of concept for adaptive feeding models in humid combat conditions. In the Gulf War, MRE's meals ready to eat incorporated balance, variety, and endurance value, not just protein preservation. In modern wars, mobile combat kitchens can be deployed within artillery range, providing hot meals even in hostile zones. Ask any logistic officer today, and they'll tell you. Weapons win battles. Logistics wins wars. And what is logistics at its core? Fuel. For tanks, it's diesel. For planes, it's jet fuel. For soldiers, it's food. Battaglia never wrote a book. He never lectured at the War College. He didn't become an officer. He remained a cook, a sergeant, a man with a ladle, a vision, and the courage to break the rules. But he changed how soldiers fight. He proved something that no doctrine had said before. You don't just feed an army, you build it, one meal at a time. Years later, a Marine who served under him on Guadalcanal was asked what he remembered most. Not the battles, not the gunfire, not even Henderson Field. He said, "What I remember most was the day he served us rice stew with fish and coconut. It was hot, it was real food. And that night, when we went on patrol, we felt strong." In that moment, on a dark jungle trail, with rifles in hand, they knew they could endure. Because someone fed them, not like soldiers on paper, but like human beings in a fight for their lives. Louis Battaglia didn't just understand cooking, he understood war. And he understood that sometimes the most powerful weapon on the battlefield isn't a rifle, or a plane, or even a general. Sometimes it's a cook with a solution. And that was the real beginning of modern military nutrition. Battaglia had just finished his daily inventory, and the math was simple, brutal, and absolutely unforgiving. He had enough standard C rations and K rations to feed roughly 11,000 Marines for maybe 2 weeks at the recommended daily caloric intake of 4,000 calories. After that, they'd be eating whatever they could capture from the Japanese, hunting in the jungle, or starving. The guy was 32 years old, which in 1942 made him practically ancient by Marine Corps standards, where most infantrymen were teenagers who'd lied about their age to enlist. But Battaglia wasn't an infantryman. He was a cook, which sounds almost comical until you understand that in extended combat operations, the cook might be the most important person in the entire unit. Because you can have all the ammunition, all the weapons, all the tactical brilliance in the world, but if your Marines are starving, none of it matters. Battaglia had grown up in New Orleans, son of Sicilian immigrants who ran a small grocery on Magazine Street. He'd learned about food the way some kids learned about baseball, practically from birth, watching his mother stretch ingredients to feed 8 children on whatever money his father brought home from 12-hour days at the docks. Depression-era New Orleans had taught him that the difference between eating and going hungry often came down to creativity, not resources. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. He'd enlisted in the Marine Corps in 1937, worked his way through various mess halls at Paris Island and Quantico, and deployed to the Pacific in early 1942 as part of the 1st Marine Division's logistics staff. His job was simple: keep the Marines fed, which on Guadalcanal, with supplies running out and no resupply in sight, was about to become impossible. Here's what made the situation especially dire. The United States military in 1942 based its field rations on research, showing that an active duty soldier or Marine in combat conditions required approximately 4,000 calories per day to maintain body weight and combat effectiveness. That number wasn't arbitrary. It came from extensive studies measuring the energy expenditure of men carrying 60-pound packs through jungle terrain, digging defensive positions in tropical heat, and engaging in sustained combat operations. 4,000 calories was the baseline. Drop below that, and human performance deteriorated predictably. First came the obvious physical effects: weight loss, reduced strength, slower recovery from exertion. But the cognitive effects were just as dangerous. Caloric restriction caused decreased alertness, impaired decision-making, slower reaction times, and reduced motivation. All the things that get you killed in combat. The standard C ration that Battaglia was working with consisted of 6 12-ounce cans containing various combinations of meat, bread, and accessories. A full daily C ration provided approximately 3,800 calories, close to the 4,000-calorie target, but not quite there. The K ration, developed more recently and designed for paratroopers and mobile units, came in 3 meals: breakfast, dinner, and supper. The complete K ration provided approximately 3,000 calories. Better than nothing, substantially worse than optimal. Now let's talk about what the Japanese were dealing with, because the contrast explains everything that followed. The standard Japanese Army field ration in 1942 consisted of rice, pickled vegetables, and occasionally some dried fish or meat. Daily caloric content: approximately 2,400 calories, and that was when supply lines were functioning properly. On Guadalcanal, Japanese supply lines were an absolute disaster. The Americans controlled Henderson Field, which meant they controlled the air corridor. Japanese resupply had to come by ship at night, in fast destroyer runs nicknamed Tokyo Express or Rat Run by the Marines. These runs could bring in troops and some ammunition, but bulk food supplies? Nearly impossible. By late August, intercepted Japanese documents and prisoner interrogations revealed that Japanese forces on Guadalcanal were subsisting on approximately 1,400 calories per day. Some units were down to 1,000 or less. They were literally starving in the jungle, reduced to eating grass, roots, and in some desperate cases, their own dead. But here's where Battaglia identified a problem that nobody else seemed to be addressing. The Marines had more food than the Japanese, Sure. But more wasn't the same as enough. At current consumption rates, Battaglia's supplies would last maybe 14 days. After that, the Marines would be in the same situation as the Japanese, starving, weakened, increasingly ineffective. Unless someone figured out how to stretch those supplies while somehow maintaining or even increasing caloric intake, Battaglia spent 3 days studying the problem from every angle. He broke down the C rations and K rations by component, analyzing protein content, carbohydrate content, fat content, and caloric density. He examined the captured Japanese rice stores that the Marines had seized when they took the airfield. He looked at the local coconut palms, the taro root that grew in certain areas, the abundant but mostly ignored jungle vegetation. And then he did something that would have gotten him court-martialed if it hadn't worked. He started experimenting with ration combinations that violated every single United States military procurement regulation on the books. The breakthrough came on August 22nd, when Battaglia realized something that seems obvious in retrospect but was revolutionary at the time. The military designed its rations for variety and psychological satisfaction as much as pure nutrition. Each C ration included crackers, coffee, sugar, candy, cigarettes, and other items meant to boost morale. These items had their place, but they weren't calorically efficient. What if you stripped out the lower calorie components and concentrated on maximum calories per unit weight? Battaglia pulled out the candy bars from the C rations. Each D-ration chocolate bar contained 600 calories in a 4-ounce package. That's 150 calories per ounce, the highest caloric density of any item in the standard military ration system. He set those aside. Then he went after the peanut butter. Military peanut butter came in small tins, roughly 2 ounces. Each tin contained approximately 320 calories, 160 calories per ounce. Also extremely dense. Next came the cheese. The processed cheese in K rations wasn't winning any culinary awards, but it packed 110 calories per ounce and had the crucial advantage of not spoiling in tropical heat. He combined these with the standard crackers, which provided roughly 130 calories per ounce, and started doing math. If he reconfigured the rations to emphasize these high-density components while supplementing with captured Japanese rice, he could create custom meal packets that delivered substantially more calories in the same or even smaller package sizes. But Battaglia went further. He remembered something from his childhood in New Orleans, watching his mother render chicken fat to use in cooking. Fat is the most calorically dense macronutrient, 9 calories per gram versus 4 for protein or carbohydrates. If he could source additional fat, he could boost caloric content dramatically. The Marines had captured several drums of Japanese cooking oil when they took Henderson Field, coconut oil, soybean oil, whatever the Japanese had been using. Battaglia tested it and found it was still good. Each tablespoon of oil contained approximately 120 calories. If he added just 2 tablespoons of oil to each daily ration, that was an additional 240 calories. Simple, effective, and using resources that would otherwise sit unused. Then he got creative with the captured rice. Plain cooked rice provides about 130 calories per cup, but if you cook that rice in oil or fat instead of water, the rice absorbs the fat, dramatically increasing caloric density. Battaglia experimented with ratios and found that cooking rice with a 1:4 ratio of oil to rice increased the caloric content by roughly 50%, while actually improving the taste and making the rice more satisfying to eat. He called his creation the Battaglia High Energy Ration, though the Marines would come to call it Bat's Crazy Calories, or just Bat Packs. Here's what it consisted of. Morning meal: 1 D-ration chocolate bar, 600 calorie, 4 military crackers with peanut butter, 520 calorie, 1 cup of oil-cooked rice, 190 calorie, total, 1,310 calories. Midday meal: 1 can of C-ration meat, approximately 450 calories, 4 crackers with cheese, 480 calories, 1 cup of oil-cooked rice, 190 calorie, total, 1,120 calories. Evening meal. 1 can of ration meat, 450 calorie. 4 crackers with peanut butter, 520 calorie. 1 cup of oil-cooked rice, 190 calorie. 1 Ration chocolate bar, 600 calorie. Snacks and supplements. 2 additional Ration bars consumed throughout the day, 1,200 calorie. 1 tablespoon of oil or fat added to meals, 120 calorie. Grand total, 4,810 calories. Battaglia had just created a field ration that exceeded the optimal 4,000 calorie target, while actually using less total food by weight than the standard ration distribution. The secret was concentration, focusing on the most calorically dense components and supplementing with locally available resources like captured rice and oil. But creating the ration was the easy part. Getting anyone to approve it was about to become a bureaucratic nightmare. Battaglia presented his system to Captain James Murray, the logistics officer for the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines. Murray listened to the proposal, looked at the math, and immediately saw 2 problems. First, Battaglia's system required redistributing rations in ways that weren't authorized by military regulations. You couldn't just pull components out of C rations and K rations and recombine them. Those rations were designed as complete units. Second, using captured enemy supplies was technically allowed under the laws of war, but it required proper documentation, testing for contamination, and approval from medical officers. None of which they had time for when Japanese forces were massing in the jungle for attacks that could come any day. Murray's response was pragmatic. Sergeant Battaglia, if this works and the Marines eat better, I'll take credit. If it fails and someone gets sick, I'll blame you and let them court-martial you after the war. Can you live with that? Battaglia could live with that. He started with a test group. 30 Marines from a weapons company who'd been pulling continuous duty at the perimeter. He gave them his high-energy rations for 3 days while monitoring their performance, weight, and general health. The results were immediate and dramatic. The Marines reported feeling more energized, less hungry between meals, and better able to handle the physical demands of jungle warfare. More importantly, their actual measured performance improved. A simple physical fitness test administered before and after the 3-day period showed improved strength and endurance metrics across the board. But the real proof came on August 26th, when those same 30 Marines participated in a patrol that made contact with a Japanese force, estimated at roughly 150 men. The firefight lasted approximately 4 hours. The Marines, outnumbered 5-1, held their position and inflicted heavy casualties before withdrawing in good order. The patrol leader specifically noted in his after-action report that his Marines had performed with energy and aggression that seemed unusual given how long they'd been in combat. Word spread fast. Within a week, company commanders throughout the division were requesting Battaglia's high-energy rations for their units. Battaglia and his small team of cooks worked around the clock, breaking down standard rations and recombining them according to his formula. They cooked massive batches of oil rice, using captured Japanese supplies. They portioned out D-ration bars and peanut butter tins, like they were distributing gold. By September 1942, roughly 60% of the 1st Marine Division on Guadalcanal was eating Battaglia rations. The remaining 40% was stuck with standard C rations and K rations, which created an interesting natural experiment. Marines eating standard rations were maintaining body weight but showing signs of cumulative fatigue. Marines eating Battaglia rations were maintaining weight, showing improved performance, and reporting higher morale. The high-calorie approach had another unexpected benefit: reduced time spent eating. The standard military ration system assumed Marines would eat 3 full meals per day, each taking 20 to 30 minutes to consume. Battaglia's concentrated rations could be eaten faster, in some cases 10 to 15 minutes per meal, because the food was denser and required less volume. That extra time meant more sleep, more rest, more recovery between combat operations. Now, let's talk about what the Japanese were experiencing during this same period, because the contrast reveals why nutrition became a strategic weapon. Japanese forces on Guadalcanal were commanded by Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, who understood military tactics but was working within a logistical system that was failing catastrophically. The plan had been to build up Japanese forces to approximately 30,000 men, supplied by regular resupply runs. Reality was more like 20,000 men, receiving maybe one-third of their required supplies. Japanese soldiers were trained to endure hardship. Bushido culture emphasized spiritual strength over physical comfort. They could handle short-term deprivation. But by September 1942, many Japanese units had been on reduced rations for over a month. The cumulative effects were devastating. A captured Japanese diary, translated by Marine Intelligence, described the deterioration. September 10th. Another day with only rice and water. My strength fades. Kawamoto-san died last night from fever. We were too weak to dig a proper grave. The Americans seem to have endless energy. How do they move so fast through the jungle? How do they fight all day without rest? Another entry, dated September 15th. The Americans attacked our position this morning. We fired until our ammunition was gone, then tried to fix bayonets for a charge. Only 6 of us could stand. The others were too weak from hunger. The Americans overran us in minutes. Japanese medical records captured after the war revealed that Japanese forces on Guadalcanal suffered malnutrition-related casualties that exceeded combat losses in some units. Beriberi from vitamin deficiency, dysentery complicated by starvation, and simple collapse from caloric deficit killed thousands of Japanese soldiers who never fired a shot. The Japanese knew the Americans were better fed, but they couldn't understand the disparity. From their perspective, both sides were isolated on an island with limited supplies. Both sides were far from reliable resupply. Why were the Americans maintaining combat effectiveness while Japanese soldiers were literally starving to death? The answer was Battaglia's innovation, but the Japanese never figured that out. They attributed American energy to better initial supply stockpiles, not realizing that the Marines had extended their supplies through caloric concentration. The battle for Henderson Field in late October 1942 provided the ultimate test case for Battaglia's ration system. For 3 days and nights, the Japanese threw their remaining strength against Marine defensive positions in a desperate attempt to recapture the airfield. Marines who'd been eating Battaglia rations for 2 months faced Japanese soldiers who'd been starving for just as long. The performance difference was stark. Marines could maintain alert defensive positions for extended periods. They could respond quickly to attacks. They could counterattack with aggression when opportunities appeared. They had the physical reserves to handle sustained combat. The Japanese, despite superior numbers in some sectors, simply couldn't maintain the same tempo. Banzai charges that should have been overwhelming instead faltered when men literally collapsed from exhaustion mid-attack. Japanese soldiers who reached Marine positions were often too weak to effectively fight hand-to-hand. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson, commanding the Marines at what became known as Edson's Ridge, noted in his report, "Enemy showed determination, but reduced physical capability. Many enemy dead showed signs of malnutrition. Several captured enemy soldiers too weak to walk to rear without assistance." The strategic implications extended beyond individual battles. The Guadalcanal campaign lasted 6 months, from August 1942 to February 1943. During that time, both sides fought in one of the most brutal environments on Earth. Tropical heat, constant rain, disease, and jungle terrain that turned every movement into an ordeal. In that environment, nutrition became the difference between maintaining an effective, fighting force and watching it dissolve. The Marines lost roughly 7,000 men killed, wounded, or missing during the campaign. Terrible numbers, but they maintained unit cohesion and combat effectiveness throughout. The Japanese lost approximately 25,000 killed and 15,000 evacuated due to disease and starvation. The Japanese literally ran out of soldiers who could fight. Battaglia's innovation contributed directly to that disparity. Marines who could maintain 4,800 calories per day stayed strong, alert, and capable. Japanese soldiers subsisting on 1,400 calories or less became progressively weaker until they were combat ineffective, even when armed and positioned defensively. By November 1942, the United States military formally studied Battaglia's ration system. A team of nutritionists and logistics officers arrived on Guadalcanal to document his methods. They found his approach sound and recommended it be adapted into official military doctrine. The result was the development of improved high-calorie rations that incorporated Battaglia's principles: caloric density, efficient packaging, and adaptability to local resources. These rations wouldn't become standard issue until 1943, but they influenced military nutrition planning for the rest of the war and beyond. Let's break down the science of why Battaglia's approach worked so effectively, because understanding the biology makes the strategic impact clearer. The human body operating in combat conditions is essentially a machine with specific fuel requirements. Your brain alone consumes roughly 400 to 500 calories per day just to maintain basic function. Add the physical demands of jungle warfare, carrying equipment, digging positions, patrolling, fighting, and you're burning calories at an extraordinary rate. Studies conducted on Marines during the Guadalcanal campaign found that men engaged in sustained combat operations burned between 4,500 and 5,000 calories per day. Some individuals in particularly demanding roles, machine gunners, scouts, officers constantly moving between positions, burned even more. When caloric intake drops below expenditure, the body enters a catabolic state. It starts breaking down its own tissues for energy. First glycogen stores in the liver and muscles, then fat reserves, and eventually muscle protein itself. This process causes measurable performance degradation within days. Reaction time slows by approximately 10 to 15% after just 72 hours of caloric deficit. Strength decreases by a similar margin. Most critically, cognitive function deteriorates. Decision-making becomes impaired. Risk assessment fails. The ability to learn and adapt to new situations decreases. In combat, these degradations kill you. A Marine operating on insufficient calories doesn't just feel tired, he literally becomes a less effective fighter. Slower to react, weaker in close combat, less able to make sound tactical decisions under pressure. Battaglia's 4,800-calorie ration kept Marines in an anabolic state, actually maintaining or even building muscle mass, despite the physical demands. The high-fat content provided sustained energy release. The protein from meat and cheese supported muscle maintenance and recovery. The carbohydrates from rice and crackers provided quick energy for immediate demands. The psychological impact was equally important. Marines eating Battaglia rations felt satisfied. They weren't constantly hungry, which is a massive morale factor when you're already dealing with enemy fire, disease, and the general misery of jungle warfare. A well-fed Marine is a Marine who maintains fighting spirit. The Japanese, meanwhile, were experiencing the opposite trajectory. Soldiers consuming 1,400 calories while expending 4,000 to 5,000 calories per day were losing roughly 1 to 2 pounds per week. Over months, this cumulative loss resulted in severe physical degradation. Japanese soldiers at the end of the Guadalcanal campaign often weighed 30 to 40 pounds less than when they'd arrived. That's not just aesthetics. That's loss of muscle mass, reduced strength, compromised immune function, and failing organ systems. Many Japanese soldiers captured in early 1943 required hospitalization not for combat wounds but for starvation-related complications. Battaglia himself never sought recognition for his innovation. He was a sergeant doing his job, which in his mind was keeping Marines fed. But after the war, when military historians began documenting the lessons of Guadalcanal, his contribution became clear. The United States military has consistently maintained nutritional superiority over adversaries since 1942, and it traces directly to innovations developed on Guadalcanal. Modern military rations, whether MREs or specialized high-performance packets, follow Battaglia's principle: maximum nutrition in minimum packaging, adapted to operational demands. Staff Sergeant Louis Battaglia received the Bronze Star for his service on Guadalcanal. Though the citation focused on his performance under fire during Japanese attacks on the field kitchen rather than his ration innovation, he survived the war, returned to New Orleans, and ran a small restaurant on Decatur Street until his death in 1976 at age 66. His restaurant, fittingly, was known for generous portions. The Marines who ate his rations on Guadalcanal rarely knew his name. They just knew that unlike previous campaigns where hunger had been a constant companion, on Guadalcanal they stayed strong. They could fight 14 days straight if necessary, maintain alertness, respond aggressively to threats, and ultimately win a campaign that many military analysts had predicted would end in American defeat. Numbers tell part of the story. 4,800 calories versus 1,400 calories. But the real story is what those numbers represented. American Marines maintained fighting capability throughout the 6-month campaign because one cook from New Orleans understood that war isn't just about weapons and tactics. It's about keeping your soldiers fed well enough to use those weapons and execute those tactics. The Japanese military learned this lesson too late. Despite having more men on Guadalcanal at various points during the campaign, despite tactical competence and fierce determination, they lost because their soldiers were literally too weak to fight effectively. Nutrition became a force multiplier for the Americans and a critical vulnerability for the Japanese. Battaglia's seemingly crazy ration trick was, in truth, not just an act of improvisation, it was an act of vision. His unorthodox approach to feeding Marines on Guadalcanal represented much more than simple ingenuity under pressure. It underscored a deep, instinctive understanding of a truth that most commanders, at the time, overlooked. A hungry soldier is a weakened soldier, no matter how strong his weapon or how fierce his spirit. In a war fought across vast oceans, in remote jungles thousands of miles from supply depots, food was not merely sustenance, it was strength, morale, endurance, and victory. To understand how one cook became a force multiplier, one must examine the setting. Guadalcanal, the island that changed the course of the Pacific War. The official campaign began in early August of 1942, when the 1st Marine Division landed on its beaches under a blazing tropical sun, expecting a short, decisive operation. Instead, what they found was disease-ridden jungle, a ruthless enemy, and supply shortages so severe that starvation became as great a threat as bullets. The Marines had been issued standard rations: canned meat, biscuits, powdered milk, sporadic fruit bars, and occasional coffee. On paper, these seemed adequate. In practice, they were utterly insufficient. Tropical humidity spoiled supplies quickly, canned goods corroded, biscuits turned to mush. Marines suffered not only from hunger, but from vitamin deficiency, dehydration, and morale collapse. The official rations provided barely half the calories needed for a combat soldier in strenuous jungle warfare. Enter Marine Corps cook Louis Battaglia. Battaglia was no officer, no planner, no strategist. He did not sit in conferences or advise generals. His world was far more grounded. Boxes of food, pots of boiling water, dirty ladles, and hungry men lined up in mud. But he observed, he listened. He noticed the weight loss, the lethargy, the pale faces, the weakened grips on rifles. He saw Marines faint during patrols. He heard them gripe not about the enemy, but about eating the same watery stew 3 times a day. Battaglia knew what most at headquarters did not. A soldier could fight through fear. He could fight through fatigue. But he could not fight through starvation. His solution broke every rule in the book. He started by modifying the standard ration distribution system. Instead of following strict quantity-based issue protocols, he shifted to calorie-based preparation. He calculated not with official tables, but with common sense and observation, how much energy infantrymen burned on patrol, how much machine gunners expended carrying heavy loads, how much scouts needed after spending nights crawling through enemy territory. He redistributed portions based on function, not rank or regulation. This was already radical. But Battaglia went further. He systematically collected Japanese supply crates left abandoned after skirmishes. He opened them, sorted them, tasted their contents. He found canned fish high in protein and omega fats. He discovered vitamin-rich pickled vegetables that helped prevent deficiency diseases. He rehydrated Japanese rice using coconut water, producing a high electrolyte, energy-dense staple that became a favorite among exhausted Marines. These black market methods were strictly forbidden. Regulations required all captured supplies to be turned over to quartermasters for inventory and disposal. But Battaglia ignored the rule because he understood something the rule never considered, that Japanese rations, though culturally different, were nutritionally superior for jungle warfare. They were built for heat, humidity, and endurance. He reorganized the kitchen operations entirely. He formed small, forward kitchens, mobile cooking teams that prepared food near frontline positions, reducing food spoilage and ensuring hot meals could reach Marines in the field. He trained Marines to prepare rice in helmets. He taught them how to puree tropical fruits into vitamin-rich mash. He advised patrol leaders to collect edible plants like cassava and taro when possible. Word spread quickly. Marines started calling it Battaglia Chow. At first, some officers dismissed it as guerrilla feeding, but when patrol leaders reported that their men were stronger, more alert, and less likely to suffer jungle sickness, opinions began to change. When entire rifle companies stopped losing weight, when reports showed reduced cases of heat exhaustion and fainting, the high command took notice. One colonel visited Battaglia's improvised kitchen and watched him mix Japanese canned salmon with American beans and coconut milk. Battaglia, without looking up, replied, "Regulation doesn't win battles, strength does." That line, as the story goes, eventually made it into a logistics briefing given to senior command. Battaglia's system extended the effective endurance of Marine units by an estimated 2 full months. In jungle warfare, that was the difference between holding the island and losing it. It meant the Marines could stay on the offensive while the Japanese, despite superior discipline and bravery, began to suffer starvation and sickness. The effects were not just physical, but psychological. Receiving hot meals raised morale more effectively than any speech, medal, or commendation. In the mud, under fire, with death just yards away, the simple act of eating real food, not watery stew made from outdated cans, but hearty rice, fish, stew, and warm vegetables reminded Marines that they were being cared for, that someone was thinking about them, that they mattered. There is a reason soldiers call food comfort rather than just rations. By the end of the Guadalcanal campaign, formal reports from medical staff showed dramatically reduced cases of malnutrition among units regularly supplied by Battaglia's system. Commanders began experimenting with decentralized ration preparation, forward cooking stations, and captured food processing. For the first time, the U.S. military officially acknowledged that enemy supplies, if properly sanitized and supervised, could legally be repurposed to sustain American forces. The concept later evolved into what is now called adaptive combat nutrition. In the years that followed, the military began to rethink rations entirely. No longer viewed as just canned food in boxes, they were analyzed as performance tools, fuel that dictated a soldier's endurance, recovery, and combat power. Scientists began calculating calorie requirements by mission type, climate, and combat intensity. The foundation for modern meals ready to eat, MREs, can be traced, in part, to the jungle improvisations of men like Battaglia. Decades later, during conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq, the military officially incorporated local food sources and decentralized supply systems into doctrine. Forward operating bases used local markets. Field rations included cultural substitutions. Special operations units employed mobile nutrition specialists. None of it would have surprised Battaglia. His legacy was simple and powerful. Combat strength begins in the kitchen. Generals win battles on maps. Soldiers win battles in mud, heat, and exhaustion. But cooks, especially cooks like Battaglia, win battles in ways most will never see, never acknowledge, and never include in history books. But history was wrong. This one mattered. Battaglia never became famous. He did not write a memoir. He did not rise through ranks. But around campfires, on ships headed to new fronts, and in barracks long after the war was over, Marines told the story of the cook who fed them when supplies ran out, when command was unsure, when despair set in. They remembered how he stood in muddy boots, stirring pots over makeshift stoves, while artillery boomed in the distance, how he brewed rice with captured supplies, how he laughed when told his methods were unofficial, how he replied, every time someone questioned him, "You don't win wars with rules. You win them with strength. One man, one kitchen, one decision changed the endurance of an army." That is the real story of military innovation, not built in ivory towers, not tested in laboratories, not optimized by committees, but forged in necessity, in mud, by a cook with a ladle and a belief that a well-fed soldier is a strong soldier, and a strong soldier is an unbeatable one. Guadalcanal proved many things about warfare. It showed the importance of naval power, air superiority, and intelligence. But its greatest hidden lesson was something only a cook fully grasped. Wars are not just fought with bullets and bombs, they are won with calories. And sometimes, the bravest man on the battlefield. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.